divides up and allocates out. It's not like that at all. People are actually being productive, and what they get ultimately reflects what they produce. Even if they're just employed by somebody, the wages they get are a reflection of the productivity of their labor. I think a simple way to see another vision of economic production which gets rid of this idea of fairness is to think about a bunch of individuals scattered across different islands in the ocean. They never interact with each other. Now, how much they have, how wealthy they are on those islands is determined by what nature bestows on them in the island. So some islands are very fruitful and easy to live in, others are a bit harsher, and the work that they do. Now, nobody would think that it was unfair that one person on one island who'd never met the people on the other island has more than the person on the other island. If you draw a political boundary around them, and so that they're both in the same country, now suddenly it becomes unfair. That seems odd, because they've just been independently producing things. Now, of course, in a modern economy, we're not islands. We work together all the time. We interact, and indeed these interactions are vastly complex and often cross borders. Supply chains nowadays tend to be global. But it's not as if everybody in the country is working together in a common enterprise, producing a pooled amount of stuff, and then it's divided up. A modern economy isn't like that at all. There are vastly different contributions by different people, not necessarily out of desert or merit, that they just are for one reason or another more productive or more successful. And that's what accounts for these differences. There's nothing unfair about it because nobody made any allocation. It's not like a parent handing out things and then you can protest, well, that's not fair, I didn't get my share. That's not how goods end up in the hands of people. It isn't allocated. I think that there's a tendency to talk about the distribution of income, and that distribution is just a statistical notion. It's just observing the differences in income. But the word suggests that somebody distributed it, and therefore, if there are inequalities, it was an unfair distribution. But as I say, that's an inaccurate model of how modern economies work. Now, probably the best argument in favor of thinking that inequality is a bad thing in itself and not just poverty is a bad thing, is that if some people have got a lot of money, there's an opportunity to alleviate poverty by transferring that money from the rich to the poor. Now, I haven't got time to go into this. I believe that there should be a social safety net. That's to say that taxes should be levied so that people in dire financial need can be helped out. The goal of that is not to bring about equality. It is to protect people from the worst suffering brought on by poverty. It's like an insurance scheme administered by the state. Now, so as I say, that's not got the goal of bringing about equality. It's just got the goal of alleviating the worst poverty. Now, why shouldn't you, though, just redistribute wealth from the very rich to the poorer? Why isn't that a good idea? The first reason it's not a good idea is that people tend to overestimate how much money is available from doing this, just how much better off the poor would be if they got all the money that the rich have. To make this vivid, let's go back to the Oxfam story. Oxfam says the richest 46 people in the world have as much money as the poorest half of the world's population, as the poorest 3.7 billion people on Earth. Well, suppose we took all that money from the 42 richest people and gave it to the 3.7 billion. How much do you think they would get? This would be a one-off payment. Roughly, what all of those 3.7 billion people would get is $300 US each. That's a one-off payment. They're not going to get it ever again, because this is wealth we're talking about, not income. That's not much. I mean, that would be nice for those people, it would be nice for, but they just get it once. It's not going to completely transform their lives. It's not going to change their basic low incomes. But it would have all sorts of bad effects. It would have bad effects on incentives. This is one of the problems with high levels of redistribution. It disincentivizes people to become wealthy, to do the things that they need to do to become productive and wealthy, because if they succeed, a lot of that money will be taken from them. It also disincentivizes people who are poorer from taking the steps that they need to take to get ahead, because they can live without doing those things. They can live off the redistribution. So although it would temporarily alleviate the poverty of the people at the bottom, it would create structural incentives which limit growth. So I don't think that if you want to help the poor, shooting for equality, which all equality requires is to bring down the incomes of the richer, that isn't the way to help them. What is the way to help? What policy measures should be taken to alleviate poverty? As I mentioned, the incomes that people derive in a market economy come basically from what they produce. So imagine you're a subsistence farmer, you're producing a variety of food that you live off yourself, you don't trade. That's your income. Your income is your own output. Now suppose that you enter a trading kind of economy. So instead of making a variety of food that you live off, you just make one thing. Onions, let's say. You produce all those onions and you sell them, and then you buy all the other stuff that you need. Well, again, your income is just what you produce. In this case, it's the value of what you produce, it's the value of the onions. Similarly, if you say, I'm not going to do this anymore, I'm going to work on a bigger commercial farm, again, the income you get, what you're paid is roughly the value of what you produce working in that farm. So what needs to happen is that people need to be more productive. Now, how is that going to be achieved? The simple answer is that productivity of workers depends on the amount of capital that they use. By capital, I don't mean money in this case, I mean tools, effectively. A hammer is capital, a tractor is capital, a computer is capital. The more capital intensive an economy, the more productive the workers and the richer they are. So what is required is for workers, poor people now, to start working with higher levels of capital. Let me just to make this vivid, my cousin in New Zealand is a farmer. He's a dairy farmer. He has about 500 cows, and he and one other worker with him milk those 500 cows every day. I think the farm produces several million in revenue, US dollars in revenue, and it's just the two of them. And they can do this because it's a highly mechanized kind of a farm. The cows are taken onto a large, round milking station, which is motorized. So you just stand there, and the cows move in front of you, and you attach the milking devices to their teats. And so you can be incredibly effective, just the two of you. He's got tractors, he's got everything you might imagine. So he can be incredibly productive as a farmer. By contrast with people who have almost no mechanization on their farms, are very unproductive. So what's required is that workers are starting to work with more and more capital. Now, how can that be brought about? So that's the result we want. What kinds of policies are going to bring it about? Well, not the ones that people concerned about inequality typically promote. They often actually promote policies that would be counter to this goal. So I'm just going to talk about two things that are important for increasing the capital intensity of an economy, and in particular, getting the poor to be working with that capital. So the first thing you need, if you're going to achieve this, is investment. I mean, buying the machinery, using the machinery, that requires investment. And investment, you need investment-friendly policies. What are investment-friendly policies? Well, the most important one is, and this is contentious at the moment, obviously, it's secure property rights. If you're going to commit large sums of money to an enterprise, to providing the capital equipment that's going to make people more productive, you need to feel secure in your ownership of the things that you've invested in. If you don't feel secure in that, you're not going to invest, or you're only going to invest at much higher rates of expected return. So it's the security of property rights, and generally speaking, the rule of law is the most important underlying element for encouraging investment. Then you need, and this is connected to the rule of law obviously, you need low levels of corruption. Corruption effectively it's like a tax. So insofar as you have to pay, in order to be able to make the investments, you have to pay, let's say, corrupt officials and so on, that makes the investment yield less. It's an extra cost. It's like a tax on investment, and so it makes it less likely to happen. It also increases your insecurity. If you think you're investing into a corrupt situation, you become anxious. You're not sure that your property rights are secure. So you need secure property rights, the rule of law, and related to that, low levels of corruption. It's also useful to have low levels of taxation on the returns from these investments. Again, it may not be nice fact about the world, but the truth is that investors are looking to maximize their post-tax return on their investment. And anything that reduces that reduces their inclination to invest, and therefore makes the economy less capital intensive. So that's what I'd call the basics of having an environment in which which is conducive to investment. But now there are other problems, because what we want to happen is that the capital that arises from this investment gets into the hands of the poor, that they are using it, and therefore their labor is becoming more productive and they get richer. How is that going to happen? Well, I think the most obvious thing is education. I'm not going to talk about education because it's a topic for several sessions later on today. One thing I will say, just very briefly before I get on to another couple of points, is that I'm very much in favor of private education. If there's somebody who works with us at the IEA, he's written several books on this area, showing that the low-cost private education in developing countries tends to be of a much higher quality than state-provided education. The reasons, there are many reasons, but the most obvious one is simply that if parents are paying the schools directly, the schools become much more accountable to the parents, and you tend to have higher standards. And what gets taught are the things that are valuable to the children rather than things that have a political goal in them. So insofar as it's possible to promote the private sector in education, and not merely for the wealthy, for everybody, that ought to be a policy goal. But as I say, I'm not going to talk much about education. I want to talk about some other things that need to happen in order to get this capital intensity up. And one thing is that you need reasonably big businesses. This is often contrary to, again, to development goals. A lot of development economists try to get capital into the hands of small businesses, money into the hands. But if you just think about it, it doesn't take too much thought to realize that scale is required. Take farming again. If you own a tiny patch of land and it doesn't make sense for you to have a tractor, that the cost of that tractor is too great in relation to the economic output of the farm. You need a bigger farm to make the investment economically rational. So scale of businesses is required. If you again go back to my cousin's farm,